Ty, I really appreciate you carving out some time today for us.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Tremendous. Well, listen, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about your role with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and maybe as well how you got interested in the field of nutrition?
Sure. So I am a research advisor at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN for short, on the knowledge leadership team. So we generate a lot of evidence to help inform our programs that really seek to improve access to nutritious and safe foods. And so I do research. I help kind of generate some evidence and knowledge to guide programs and also to learn from programs and for the broader community around, how should we really improve people's diets and what are the things that we should be considering. That's GAIN. And I started working here directly out of my graduate program at UC Davis.
Yeah.
So my undergraduate was in a different field. It was in kind of media arts. I was in a band in college. I didn't really have much nutrition interest.
Nice.
But a couple of years after graduating, I started to gain an interest for my own reasons because I had some health issues. And so I started reading on my own and learning and ended up really helping out a lot of my issues and resolving some important health issues. And a couple of family members did so as well. And so I was like, wow, this is pretty powerful. I would really like to learn more. And I ended up going to UC Davis for geography, but they had a program that enabled me to focus on global nutrition. So I did kind of a mix of nutrition and geography, some ecology and agriculture courses as well. So it was really interesting, really kind of a broad mix of disciplines, but that was kind of what I was interested in. And ultimately, the food systems in which I work now are pretty broad. They span all sorts of sectors. So it's pretty nice to be able to approach nutrition from that perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting to have that sort of eclectic mix and a real breadth of knowledge in different areas. And obviously, when we're dealing with complex problems like food and the food systems, that comes in pretty handy. And, in your work in the last few decades and probably longer, obviously, a real polarization here of these arguments of animal versus plant. And it's become a real ideological battleground. And not just amongst the general population, seemingly amongst scientists as well. So, in your opinion and research, what do you think are some of the reasons, or even some of the nuances for this increasing polarization, which seems mostly in a lot of the Western discourse?
Yeah, that's a great point. I certainly am exposed to a lot of polarization from all sorts, researchers, social media, etc. And I think it's really driven around a few different issues. One of the largest ones for scientists is probably the environmental side of things. So, how do we sustainably produce food for a growing global population, approaching 10 billion by 2060, 2070? How can we do this with our limited resources? So, animal source foods often get a bad rap. Beef is often in the news for, destroying rainforest, driving all sorts of problems, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. So that's sort of a lot of scientists are, hesitant to really kind of promote or encourage animal source foods in some contexts because of that concern. And then they're also attacked, I'm sure, as you know, from sort of the nutrition side. There's this idea that plant-based is always healthy and better, and animal source foods are kind of to be discouraged in the West, at least. It's not really the way it is if you look globally. Actually, the animal source foods are really prized for they're kind of aspirational, and they also, of course, they fill you up. They're high in protein. So this dissonance, I think, is really interesting because, in the West, if you look at most of the people who are sort of advocating for reductions or limitations or, drastic limitations or even exclusion of animal source foods, they're in Western countries. They're in the US, they're in Europe or Australia. You don't really see that in other countries. I think that's important to recognize because most of the world is actually not in high income countries. About 84% of the world are people living in low and middle income countries, and they have a very different perspective. So it's certainly possible to have a healthy diet with very little animal source foods if you're really careful and intentional about it, but it's not always easy. And I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. And the challenges of the busyness and hecticness of life, whatever country you're in. And obviously it compounds things when we're lower middle income because we have to then make certain decisions. And if we maybe start this conversation at the policy level, the great food transformation by the Eat Lancet Commission there in 2019, targeting red meat as both an unhealthy food and, of course, environmentally harmful. Now, of course, we have things like factory farming and whatnot that we'll touch on a little further on in this discussion. But can you comment a little bit? I mean, you've touched on it here, but in terms of identifying something so in such a binary way as healthy versus unhealthy seems to ignore a lot of the nuances. Could you shed some light?
Yeah, I think that's well, certainly I agree. And that's, the recent paper we wrote on animal source foods is really to combat this idea that animal source foods are not healthy, they're not sustainable, they're not ethical. Beef I think is a key one. On the nutrition side, it's saturated fat, it's risk of cancer, it's even diabetes has been implicated. There's a lot of different potential issues, and processed meat is, there's a bit more evidence behind that. This sort of great food transformation or trying to transform food systems, I think it's necessary to make important changes across the food system to grow our food sustainably, especially considering the increasing global population. But of course, there is a lot of nuance in that. And I don't think it's helpful to have a message that meat is bad or red meat even is bad and all plants are fine, because there's actually a lot of undernutrition, which are sort of deficiencies in nutrients, things like iron and zinc, stunting in children, anemia in women as well. The causes of these are actually from very low intake of animal source food or not enough intake. And so I think it's important to just realize there are some risk of animal source foods, of course, and there are a lot of benefits. But what I don't really appreciate is when there's sort of a one-sided view that really there's no benefit to consuming meat, there's no benefit to animal source foods. We really should just be transitioning to plant-based foods. I think that's it's not really reflective of the evidence, and it can actually be problematic if you think about society and livelihoods and cultures and how we kind of depend on different sources of food and income.
Yeah, definitely, obviously, a lot to unpack there, and I think some of the ones that you mentioned, even within the Eat Lancet guidelines of, eggs being a lower recommendation than even sugar, which seems really bizarre when we just think of nutrient density and, of course, energy. And your recent paper, Animal Source Foods in Healthy, Sustainable, and Ethical Diets, so many different avenues to discuss, and you touch on three areas that we sort of oversimplify the narrative. The first being human health, which we'll dive into now, and of course the planet, and then the animals themselves. And when we talk about why, the case against animal-based sources is often, as we're saying here, overstated. Nutrient deficiencies is definitely one, which you touched on there. The other one that we see is that association with particularly processed red meat comes with the overconsumption of the energy dense foods that you get with the rest of your Happy Meal, which is the French fries, the soda, and everything else, which confounds things. So can you talk a little bit about on that health side, that why might that case against meat be overstated?
Yeah, I think you raise an important point. There's a lot of observational studies that look at correlations between things. And so you can look at, how much red meat do you consume, how much processed meat do you consume, and what are your health risks? And in these studies, there's no way to absolutely detect some sort of causal relationship, but there is an attempt, at least in well-designed studies, to say, look, let's try to account for a lot of what are called confounding variables. So variables that may be actually deriving the causal relationship. So let's say it's the Happy Meal or the Big Mac. It could be the fries or the soda. It could be that the people who eat that type of food are less active. It could be that they have lower income. All of these factors, and in modeling, a lot of studies try to account for some of those, and they say, okay, we're going to adjust for that in a model that's like a multivariable model. The problem is a couple things. One, we can't measure, and we don't measure all of the what we would say are known potential confounders. So we don't always have data on everything that could be confounding the relationship. And second, there are a number of confounders that we don't have a clear idea. And so observational evidence can only provide so much insight. And when you look at the evidence, you actually see some conflicting findings. We see some studies showing that there is a pretty clear association between red meat and processed meat, and other studies that show less of an association or no association. But in general, processed meat has much stronger associations, and there's actually more, I think, reasoning for why that can be problematic. Sodium, preservatives like nitrates and nitrites, etc. Unprocessed red meat, there are a few different pathways. Foods high in saturated fat can increased cholesterol. There is some concern with high amounts of heme iron, especially if you don't have a lot of plant-rich foods and fiber and things that are actually kind of protect against any excess in heme iron. But in general, it's a smaller segment of the population that really has an issue with too much, probably. And so, yeah, it's complicated, but ultimately the evidence is mixed with unprocessed red meat. And I think from my perspective, people are all over the map on this. My perspective, there's sort of a U-shaped curve. You have too little red meat that's actually not optimal in a lot of ways. Not that you can't be optimally healthy, but for most people,
Yeah.
adding in some unprocessed red meat to a balanced diet really can help improve satiety, improve nutrient adequacy, et cetera. And there's not a lot of evidence that moderate amounts can really increase your risks substantially of non-communicable diseases. So if I say moderate amounts, what I'm referring to is something probably around the range of 10 to 45 grams of red meat, something in that. It's a kind of broad range there, but something where it's not above the WHO recommendations for cancer risk. And so what you tend to see is when you get to higher levels of intake, there is an increased risk. And for me, that's my perspective. I think you have a lot of sort of plant-based or vegans advocates showing evidence of replacement studies where you model the replacement of red meat with a plant protein.
Yep.
And you often see a benefit to cardiovascular disease or different non-communicable disease risk factors. And so there is that piece of evidence. I think that's important to consider. But what I also think is important is that it's not necessarily the replacement of red meat. It could be that it's the inclusion of these plant-rich foods. So what if you replace something else? What if you replace starchy vegetables? What if you replace the ultra-processed foods that you're consuming? I think you'd see a really strong benefit. And so I'm not really convinced that moderate amounts of unprocessed red meat are an increased risk, and they have a lot of benefits. So I would sort of say they're around the neutral range to positive if you think about their overall contribution.
Yeah, it's interesting when we look at like type 2 diabetes is the one that really jumps out at me, because we know, I had Dr. Nicola Guess on a few years back, and 90% of diabetes reversal, if we want to call it remission, is due to weight loss. And how do we support weight loss? Well, we have, less energy dense foods and more nutrient dense foods. And that's a big trigger. And so protein plays a big role. And so that one always seems to jump out in a sense of, the processed meat intake really being a proxy for a lot of the overconsumption of the ultra processed foods, because obviously we're going to bring on board a lot of energy as that intake goes up. And interesting to see in your paper, several of the large scale population based studies. So, leading healthy lifestyles like the Oxford EPIC study and the 45 and up study, where those negative effects of red meat on all-cause mortality are being really flushed out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this has actually been confirmed in a few different recent studies. There's a randomized controlled trial, I think on either the Mediterranean diet or paleo diet, and the other study was a cohort study on one of those. I can't remember which is which, but basically both of those kind of showed unprocessed red meat to reasonably moderate amounts, even to, by some consideration, high amounts, can actually be compatible with really good heart health and low risk of these chronic diseases. So I think the evidence in general, like you're saying, it's much more that the ultra processed foods, which are a much larger share of our diet in the Western context, over half of our diet is from these ultra processed foods. And those are, in general, the studies kind of show, when you account for that, if you remove the ultra processed foods, or if you reduce them and have red meat in the context of a balanced diet, it's usually not associated with increased risk. And so,
yeah, I mean, it is fascinating being over here in the UK now. And you talked about how, UK, Canada, the US, over 50% of household spending is ultra processed food. And it's strange when you can get on a train for 2 hours and be in France, and all of a sudden that number drops to 14%. Or you go to Spain and it's 20%, or Italy, 13, 14%. And the thing that jumps out at me in places, especially like France and Italy and Spain, is the cardiovascular rates are much lower than in North America. And, recently, obviously, I think it was the WHO or another organization showing that the longest living folks will be in Spain by 2040. And so there's a lot that idea that the dietary pattern plays a big role in everything seems to be highlighted when we talk about some of those areas. But for now, I'd like to shift over from something you touched on in your paper on pediatric health. So the question around, plant-based, animal-based, when we talk about kids, becomes even more let's call it compelling, because there are some important things to consider on the nutrition side, as well as even if we talk sort of policy. But can you share with us, what are some of the nutrients here that we need to really be thinking about when it comes to kids' health and a 100% plant-based diet?
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right that the risk of sort of a 100% plant-based diet or a vegan diet, or even a diet low in animal source foods, is higher for young children, especially young children who are just starting to eat solid foods, who have really increased requirements and are actually growing faster than at any other point in life. That 6 to 23 month period, their brain is rapidly developing, and so there are a lot of essential nutrients that they require during that time. And children have small stomachs; they can't really consume a large quantity of food. So the foods that they do eat need to be nutrient dense. There's also this sort of factor of, it's not just about the single nutrients; it's the complex food matrix and the cofactors that can really improve growth and development. But when we look at specific nutrients, there's a set of micronutrients, and then there are sort of like essential amino acids and essential fatty acids that can be lacking. And this is especially evident when, in the context that I often work are in low and middle income countries in Africa and in South Asia. And what we see is that, iron deficiency is very common. The requirements are really high in young children. Zinc deficiency is also common. And then oftentimes things like vitamin B12, calcium, vitamin A can also be lacking, as well as folate. And so many of those nutrients are actually in their most dense and bioavailable forms in animal source foods. So you have heme iron in red meat and other animal source foods. You have forms that are, zinc, there's no anti-nutrient like phytate, which is sort of in the plant-based form, and pulses like beans, peas, and lentils. So you may have a similar amount of zinc or iron, but the inhibition, it's not as bioavailable. Yeah. And so we actually notice that, and it's a bit more problematic, especially for younger children who don't consume enough. And then, of course, like protein is one thing, and there's actually estimated to be about 1 billion people with not enough protein intake in terms of recommended intakes globally. But even those who do have, meet the requirement or the recommended intakes, they often have, especially in young children, low circulating essential amino acids, and that's actually impacting their growth and development. So it's not that just having enough protein is enough. You really need to make sure that the diets, have enough of essential amino acids. And the same thing for essential fatty acids, omega-3s, the long chain form like DHA and EPA, much more bioavailable, and plant source forms are usually converted at about 10 to 1 or less than that. And so all of these nutrients kind of act together, and it's hard to say which is most important. But what we do know is that having a diet that's low in animal source foods for a young child and even adolescents as they're growing and developing is typically not optimal. Now, if you have access to a really diverse range of healthy plant foods and things like dark green leafy vegetables, and you're consuming lots of them, pulses like lentils and whatnot, and you have access to fortified foods and supplements, you can be okay. But it's something that it's not necessarily given enough attention.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those ones where in the Western, if we're in a middle upper class demographics, there's kind of more bandwidth. There's more room for error, let's call it, when we have exposure to these foods that we can get. When you talk about the diverse foods, we've got support from doctors, dietitians. But when we get to lower middle income, even in Western countries, and of course in other countries, then that room for error gets really slim, doesn't it? We're much more prone to sort of deficiency. And you cite in your paper how a lot of professional organizations like the Belgian Royal Academy of Medicine or the Swiss Federal Commission for Nutrition actually discourage veganism or vegetarianism in very young populations. And that even the Italian Pediatric Organization stated that vegan and vegetarian diets are inadequate for a lot of the neuropsychomotor development. And so I'm sure some people listening in are saying, geez, you're really anti 100% plant-based diet. I think it's obviously, as you're presenting, these are just an area that we really need to be focused and concerned on, because the repercussions later on are really significant here, right?
Absolutely. And I would probably just to make sure that I don't get hit from the plant-based community, that it's been pointed out to me on social media that there are many national organizations that actually do support a well-planned vegan diet. So It's mixed, and I don't know what the total number is, but I think the point is that there is an increased risk of inadequate nutrient intake. I mean, that's just the case. When you restrict a very nutrient dense food source from the diet, it's going to be an increased risk. I think more power to people who can and want to do that in a way that's healthy. But I think when we're talking about kids who don't have control of their diet, I think we have a responsibility to make sure they're getting the nutrients they need, because as you said, you can have lifelong consequences. This is more the case in low and middle income countries if you have stunted growth, if you don't develop during these key stages. But certainly you're not going to have optimal health if you don't pay attention to the nutrients that you need to consume. And so pay attention to things like iron if you're going without animal source foods. Check iron levels for children, for kids, adolescents. Check zinc, making sure B12 is there. I think those nutrients, and then DHA and EPA as well.
I mean, it's a theme that you talk about throughout the paper, this idea of sort of context and where are we in the world and what's the culture, because this is going to really influence the strategy that we're using. And when 4 out of 8 food groups contributing to the World Health Organization's minimum dietary diversity score are coming from animals, then this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. It's, you share a great graphic in the paper around, the quantity of food from organ meats like liver compared to some of the plant-based alternatives. And again, it's not to pit one versus the other, but it's to say that these can provide a pretty valuable source, particularly in these lower to middle income countries. Because what was it about, the portion of organ meat would be 100 times the portion of a pulse to achieve the similar amounts of things like iron, zinc, vitamin A, B12. That's pretty profound when we're talking about malnutrition around the world being quite prevalent, some 750 million to 800 million children, more or less. Is that right?
Yeah, I think when you look at the numbers for undernutrition, 150 million children under 5 are stunted. So that's sort of, they're not growing at the rate that they need to grow. 570 million women, 15 to 49, have anemia. And then we're doing a study on deficiencies, and over 1 billion people have deficiencies, and it's probably larger than that. So it is important. And I think in the paper, we have this analysis where we look at, here's a range of foods that are from animal source foods and plant source foods. And these are sort of nutrients that are commonly lacking. Now, there are a lot of nutrients that are not listed there that can be problematic. Like in high income countries, you generally see, magnesium, potassium, vitamin E, those can be problematic as well. But the point here is that we have the most evidence on these nutrients globally, and they're actually causing severe impacts to health. And so when you look at those nutrients, you're absolutely right. There's orders of magnitude different levels of nutrient density of these key nutrients when you take into account bioavailability. So things like liver, small fish, eggs, ruminant meat, you can have really a lot smaller quantities to get the same nutrient value of these key nutrients. And so I think people don't really realize that. And there's sort of a misconception that nutrient requirements are the same regardless of what your diet is. That's really not the case. For example, if you have a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet, the requirements for iron and zinc are actually much higher than they are if you have an omnivorous diet. And so you can't have the same targets. They're actually higher targets. And that's the case in the US and the RDA. And there's that recommendation in there, and that's kind of worldwide.
Yeah, and a big one. I mean, you talked about iron. I mean, I think it's about 1.7 times the RDA if it's purely from plant-based. So it just adds a layer of challenge. And again, not that it can't be done, and we see it done successfully in the West, but these are, I like the theme of the paper of just saying, well, depending on where we are in the world, we can't have a blanket approach of trying to shift all of the food system in one direction, because we're going to leave a heck of a lot of people potentially very exposed. And shifting gears a little bit, that brings us to the concept of, hey, we're using technology. We're going to be able to, we can already grow meat in the lab. Can we use this to replace the meat that we're consuming? Obviously, we're replicating the macronutrients and the key vitamins and minerals, but can this actually really replace animal source foods?
Yeah, that's a good question that I'm not going to answer directly, but I will say,
no worries.
I'm going to be looking into this more. I'm going to working on a paper now that's kind of reviewing the nutrition environmental impacts of animal source foods, and I want to do a sort of deep dive into these alternative options. I think one thing we know for sure, and this is from a colleague of mine, Stefan Van Vliet, who looked at sort of the plant-based meat alternatives that they can have the same nutrition facts panel. So like you said, macronutrients are matched. They can even have, to some in some cases, some of the micronutrients can be similar.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at them from a metabolomics perspective, you look at the actual complexity of the compounds in those foods, which there are many thousands, they're actually mostly different. So there's over 90% difference. Now, there really is not a lot of evidence to say which is healthier or what are the health risks or benefits, but there is at least this point that they're not the same. And I think it's an area where we need to look into it further. The other thing, the food matrix is a big factor in terms of risk of non-communicable disease and nutrient absorption. And if you have a food that has its matrix preserved, there's sort of a slower breakdown of those components. And what we actually see when you talk about ultra processed foods that have been highly processed, the food matrix is destroyed or altered significantly. And I think that can lead to hyperpalatability. You have increased consumption where our appetite or our satiety regulation mechanisms are not functioning properly. They don't know what to do with that. And so I think that's an important piece. But there are a lot of potential, like you said, lab-based or cell-based meat, potential options, mycoproteins, precision fermentation, dairy. I mean, these are things I don't know a lot about, but that are on my radar. And I think if you look practically, they're probably going to play a larger role going forward, and an increasingly larger role to replace some animal source foods. But I think what we need to just be careful of is to just be evidence-based. Try to look holistically at the implications of this. What are the resource implications, the use of fossil fuels or energy, and then just let's make decisions that are based on that. I think ultimately there are still a lot of reasons if we think about this sort of push to reduce, heavily restrict or eliminate animal source foods. There's gastronomic legacy with certain animal source foods that have been around for a long time. They're rich, like, cultural traditions that are, animal source foods are a key part of. So I think in addition to the many other factors, livelihoods, ecosystem function, thinking about regenerative type production, there's a lot of reasons, I think, to include livestock in food production.
Yeah, it is a fascinating area. And we had Stefan on last year in the podcast, and just all these various compounds. I mean, it blows your mind to think 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. And of course, these other nutrients, the carnosines, the anserines, the taurines, all these types of things that it's difficult to mimic. What I'd like to do now is shift on the animal source foods, how they impact the planet. And I think whether you're on one end of the spectrum and you're sort of paleo or carnivore, and you're the other end of the spectrum, plant-based, interesting to me is that both of those groups can really agree that factory farming isn't something that is desirable, right? For the animal, for the planet. Maybe that's where the fake meats help out in terms of some of the fast food. But, if we look at the adverse impacts of industrialization of farming, which really seems to be where a lot of things pivoted, with a lot of the adverse impacts on animal welfare and the planet. And of course, we need to feed a lot of people on the planet. This is obviously a broad area. What about if we start with the claims about water with animals? It's often stated that about 1 kilogram of beef consumes over 15,000 liters of water. Is that accurate? Are there some nuances there that we should be taking into consideration?
Yeah, so that's a great point, that the water use really depends on the type of water. And what is pretty clear is that in a natural environment of a rangeland or grassland, there's a certain amount of rainfall that comes naturally on that ground. And if you include that water, which is often included in these assessments of water use, that water is going to be there regardless of if you have cattle on the land or not. And so
it's going to rain. Doesn't matter what's on that land.
It's going to rain. Yeah. And in fact, when you look at the difference in water retention from a farm, like a monoculture, where it's tilled regularly versus some sort of regenerative, diverse production where you have cattle grazing on that land, we have sometimes upwards of 100 species of grasses, forbs, legumes. You can actually increase the water absorption capacity of that soil. So you're actually storing more of the water, and then the cattle are consuming it. So in general, I think the claims are overstated on the water side. When you look at the actual type of water that's going to be used, really what we should be looking at is what water are we taking from sources that would otherwise need to be used for drinking water. So groundwater, et cetera, that It's the rainwater in the context of a pastured system is not going to be something that's going to be a negative impact, because that's part of the natural ecosystem. So I think that's key. And you bring up the good point about water. Other plant-based foods can take a lot of water. You think about nuts. Most of the nut production, almonds, et cetera, come from California, where there actually is a lot of water scarcity. And so just going plant-based for, say, a metric like water use would not be particularly smart, because a lot of crops take a lot of water to produce.
Yeah, I think that region in California, where they have the majority of the almond farms, is actually the most impacted from that lack of water. So that is interesting that there's layers to this. And, the next argument that we often hear is that animal feed competes with the crops that would otherwise be, suitable for a human diet. And so we're feeding about 6 to 20 kilograms of grain to produce a kilogram of meat. Is that accurate, or what are some of the nuances there?
There's probably a case for making that claim, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. So for starters, you don't just consume one food like a grain, for example. And so if you just replace meat with a grain, you're not just going to consume that. You need to consume a diet that's balanced and meets your nutrition requirements.
Mm-hmm.
If you're growing crops for livestock feed directly, that is not an efficient use of land, because you can, in general, if you're feeding the crops that would otherwise go to humans, you would need more land to be able to produce that. You would need more ultimate food. But what people don't perhaps recognize is that most of the diet, especially for ruminants, comes from inedible foods. So this is the
stuff that we can't eat.
Yeah, this is the residues, the crop residues. So after a harvest of soybeans or corn, the cattle can graze and eat the leftovers that we can't eat. Most of their diet, if you look at ruminants, it's actually grasses and other foods that we can't eat. So this is roaming around on natural grasslands that oftentimes aren't suitable for crop production anyways. A lot of the Earth's surface is covered in rangelands. There's a lot of reasons why that can't be produced. The soil isn't fertile enough. Maybe it's too steep or too rocky. Mm-hmm. But livestock can actually graze that land. So when you look at it from the human food feed competition, I think there is a lot of livestock that could be produced in much more sustainable ways. And I think, like you're saying, the factory farming, where you sort of have a monoculture that's producing the feed, and then you're feeding that to livestock, is not an efficient process. And there's a lot of harmful consequences to that. But what it doesn't mean is that we can't produce livestock in sustainable ways. I think there's certainly ways to produce it, integrating livestock into these regenerative type production, having circular approaches.
Yeah, I mean, a few things that jumped out for me from your paper was, only 5% of the global feed intake consists of grains and soybean meal that would be in direct competition for the human diet. So that's not a lot, obviously. And the fact that ruminants need less protein from human edible feed, what is it, like 0.6 kilograms, than what they deliver as 1 kilogram of that high quality protein is a pretty important metric, isn't it? When we're talking about how do we provide nutrient dense, lower energy foods to the population whilst contributing to, this healthy ecosystem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. Like when you could think about the actual amount of food competing for human resources for ruminants, it's about 5%, even potentially less than that. And so most of their diet is largely inedible, and they're really efficient. They're ruminants for a reason, right? They can ferment that material into really nutrient.
Yeah, being able to take advantage of that upcycling seems like a benefit that hopefully we should still be able to harness. And what about the flip side when we think about just monocrops in general? I mean, if we're growing large single crops of vegetables, what are the potential pitfalls there for diversity? Because sometimes we just default to this heuristic of, if we just have plants, well, then we're just going to have more, diversity as a result of that.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that all food production has an impact on the environment, and there are better and worse ways to produce food. So if our replacement of animal source foods comes from an industrial intensive monoculture, that may be efficient. And in the short term, in providing a lot of fossil fuel derived inputs can create high yields and on a low amount of land. But of course, there's nutrient pollution, there's runoff into waterways. There's a destruction of the ecosystem of that land where the crops are produced. So there's not much life on that land. A lot of animals can be actually harmed in that process through pesticides, through tilling, et cetera. The soil health diversity is really low. So that's sort of a case for industrial type farming, oftentimes can be problematic, whether it's for crops or for livestock. But that doesn't also, of course, it doesn't mean that there aren't sustainable ways to produce plant source foods and crops, and there certainly are. And I think there is, when you look at diverse, agro-ecosystems that combine a lot of different species of crops, and they can have biodiversity increased on the land itself. They can actually be a place for birds to come. You can integrate into livestock systems, fruit trees. You can have these, what are kind of called agroforestry. So there are these potential pathways to do this, which doesn't mean that everybody needs to eat animal source foods, but what it means is that there are actually sustainable ways to produce at least a moderate amount of animal source foods. Now, I think the big debate probably comes over how much can we sustainably produce and where, and which types of food and what production methods, because there is a concern, animal source foods can take a lot of land. They can be problematic if they're not done properly and in balance. And that's sort of where I think the future direction of research should go, is to try to quantify in different contexts. Really, the local context should be key. That's cultural, that's ecological context. What types of foods can be produced and in what ways?
Yeah, it does become frustrating when we think about just the food waste, especially when it comes to the amount of inputs required to produce animal foods. And then as we're talking about, there is a cost to that. And then the food waste being so astronomically high around the world that even just, I don't know if it was Nigel Bloom or another doc or researcher talking about how we could, just that alone would really move the needle quite a bit. If we talk about the last, there's many more, but if we talk about a third component here around the environment, which is greenhouse gas emissions, that's another one that often gets cited by various on social media and media at different outlets. How much does our diet contribute to greenhouse gas emissions as compared to, housing, transportation, the stuff that we buy, the technology in our pockets, and even within diet, how does that sort of break down? Could you walk us through what you guys outline in the paper?
Yeah, so I think in the paper we're cautious to not say that greenhouse gas emissions from food production don't matter, because they do,
for sure.
And there is an impact, of course, and ruminants belch methane, and that contributes to our sort of what we consider anthropogenic emissions, the human caused emissions. There's a few points that we make. One is that if you have a natural ecosystem that's functioning properly, and every ecosystem includes plants and animals and whatnot. So if you have a rangeland where you would often where there are typically grasslands of cattle grazing, there are going to be wild ruminants on that land. There are going to be deer. Prehistorically there were larger megafauna, and things like termites actually generate a lot of methane. So there is some base level of methane when you think about just natural, grasslands or ecosystems that would function. So we want to look more holistically at that methane. And when it was not a problem because of the cycle of methane. So if animals are living in a natural ecosystem, there's methane is a short-lived greenhouse gas. So as opposed to CO2, which can take over 100 years to be removed from the atmosphere, methane lasts, I think, probably around closer to 10 years. And it has a high warming potential, which is problematic, which means it's actually contributing to a lot of warming, but it also has a natural process of removal. So there's a methane cycle, and it doesn't contribute to increased warming if you have a base level of livestock or ruminants, but certainly there are ways to mitigate. I think one of the metrics that we often see, though, is that the greenhouse gas emissions are not always considering how long the greenhouse gas is staying in the atmosphere. And so ruminants will get a bad rap because methane is this really warming gas, and look how much they're belching. This is problematic, but it depends on how you sort of look at the overall system. There are also a lot of innovative ways to reduce these emissions in ruminants. So feeding certain types of seaweed, other additives that can actually reduce quite a bit. And I think that's an important consideration. So in general, my perspective is that we need to look at the emissions and we need to try to moderate. I don't think we can have as much meat as we want, as some people can argue from some circles.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I don't think the answer means that we can have zero. Other forms of crop production like rice production can produce actually quite a bit of methane too. So I think it's just important to consider how we produce food. I think one of the points that I would like to make that I think maybe those of us who are sort of advocates of having a moderate amount of animal source foods don't always acknowledge is that the quickest way to reduce global warming can also be to reduce the methane in the atmosphere. Even if it's a part of a natural cycle, one of the quickest levers we have is to reduce that. So I think it is a worthwhile consideration to figure out how to get that as low as possible, while also considering environmental impact more holistically, because ruminants are much more than the greenhouse gas emissions they emit. They can increase biodiversity on land. They can actually be used to conserve rangelands. In the US, the World Wildlife Fund actually has some programs to help work with ranchers to conserve lands and make sure that they're producing their livestock in a way that is beneficial to the environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when we look at, just the ground being a big carbon sink and its ability to soak up and sequester. And so when we talk about things, if we get to the animal side now, sort of the effect of animal source foods on the actual animal welfare, regenerative farming techniques seem to be a system where the animal does have a better life, much more so than factory farming. I'm sure all can agree. There is potential in terms of the impact on, whether it's biodiversity, things like topsoil. Now, I know people in the plant-based community would argue that a lot of those things get over-exaggerated in terms of its potential. As you mentioned, we're probably going to have to eat less meat. The question is, some groups want to eliminate altogether versus others advocating for the fact that it can be part of the food system and an ecosystem. So, from what you've looked at in the paper and from your point of view, in terms of regenerative farming techniques, things like that, is that going to be potentially playing a key role in this whole story?
Yeah, I'm actually really pleased to see some unity in this. I think this is probably a more recent consensus that most researchers, even those who are very kind of on the side of heavy reduction of livestock, they're really proponents of regenerative agriculture, or, different words of this are nature positive production or whatnot, agroecology, different forms of production that can actually have some benefits to the environment. And so I think that's that. And as you mentioned earlier, food waste are sort of some of the less, those are areas that a lot of scientists can agree upon, because regardless of what foods are being produced, there are ways to reduce the environmental impact. The regenerative production, there's a few points on this. So one is that if you can produce a lot of different types of products and foods, you can actually have a pretty productive, both for the farmer, so the farmer can make good money on their land, and also produce things in a sustainable way. So as opposed to just growing one crop, you have different crops, you have livestock, you can produce honey, you can produce products from the livestock, really trying to make use of a lot of different things. And so the overall productivity of the land can be very high, even if the yield of one particular item is not any higher than in a conventional system.
Interesting. Effectively, that sort of leads in, as we sort of get towards the tail end here, I'm always thinking about, what are elements that the two groups on the opposing sides of the spectrum can start to agree on. You've touched on a few already in terms of regenerative agriculture and reducing food waste. Where do you see this conversation going of, rather than this polarization, finding this common ground in the middle that we can actually start enacting some strategies and some policies to start making a difference?
Yeah, I think that's the right question, because polarization is not constructive. I think there's a lot of just negative feedback loops. There's a lot of, I think, unproductive, sort of argumentative type approaches, or not approaches, but interactions. And so one thing that everybody should be able to agree on is that we want people to have healthy diets, to be able to live their full potential, to be free of disease, right? And there are different perspectives on how to best do that. But if you look at just from the health side, we can agree. Most people are working on this, and let's give people the benefit of the doubt. If you're much more plant-based, if you're less plant-based, people care about diets, especially if you're working in this area. We want people to be healthy. And so I think that is going to give people, I think, a sense of, look, we're all humans, especially if we work in this field. We're working towards improving lives of people. So let's work towards commonalities there. Now, when you get into the question of how to do it, that's sort of a lot of the debate. And same thing for the environment. I know very personally, like I care a lot about the environment. My co-authors on this paper care a lot about the environment, but we don't think that a heavy restriction or elimination of animal source foods is necessarily the best way to go about approaching our food system. So maybe we can reach commonalities of how do we produce food in a more environmentally beneficial way. How can we start shifting away from the really destructive practices? So how can we shift away from the ultra processed foods that are causing a lot of health issues? And how can we shift away from farming practices that are harming animals, that are really inhumane? I think we can make a lot of progress towards that. Of course, people who don't believe that consuming animal source foods is ethical in any way, you can't really reach common ground there, because there's no ethical argument that you can make that is going to convince people of that perspective that it's okay to eat animal source foods. But what you can probably agree upon is that there are better and worse ways to treat animals. And so if you're a more practical person on that side of the, a practical vegan, you could say, okay, well, let's at least agree, like let's cut out some of these really harmful practices that, chickens in cages crammed together. Let's treat animals the best we can. And let's use our, I think we need to work towards productive agricultural systems that are also facilitate biodiversity and are healthy to the ecosystem. So rather than, there's sort of two approaches. There's kind of this, there's a land sharing or a land sparing debate. Like, let's produce all the food in really efficient, intensive ways so that we can use as little land as possible. But the land that you do use is really kind of destroyed, and it's not sustainable for that land, right? And then there's other consequences of pollution and whatnot. Or can we, trying to really just favor, how can we have as minimal impact on the environment as possible, but we can't produce a lot of food? I think you can kind of merge those to some extent, say, and that's what I think regenerative agriculture can do. Say, let's produce things in ways that are actually producing a lot of overall food, nutritious, diverse foods, but also using land efficiently, not trying to, because we have to, and really, I think favoring the local ecosystem and context, because there's no benefit to clearing rainforest for crop production or crop production for livestock feed. There's, we have to work towards halting any of those types of practices.
Yeah, I love that, concept and philosophy of when we're working with patients, clients, we want our clients to be healthy. I don't care what dietary strategy you use, really. I want the end point to be health and happiness, and the same for the planet, right? We want to have a healthy planet. And so starting from a place of agreement, I guess is what I'm saying, is always a great place to, even amongst polarized groups, because like you're saying, then we can at least agree on the outcome. And then the debate comes with what strategies we want to implement. And it's with complex problems, it is important to have a diverse array of inputs and strategies, rather than putting all of our eggs into one basket, so to speak, in terms of a certain strategy. Now, I want to respect your time here, Ty, but at an individual level, what could someone who is, consumes animal-based foods but wants to make an impact in their own lives, from your research or from your own insights, where's a place for people to start?
Yeah, I think that's depends on where you're living, of course. If you have the means to purchase from local type of farms or livestock production systems that are regenerative and that are having either minimal impact on the environment or positive impact, that's one way to do it, right? Vote with your purchase. I think that's the case for animal welfare, right? If you go to Whole Foods and you have the funds to pay for that, you can support, you can buy animal source foods from producers that have some certifications on their treatment of animals. So I think that's a place to start when you're in the West. You could also reduce intake of animal source foods, especially if you're eating a diverse diet and you're paying attention to your key nutrients. Some of the things that I think are really good options are soy milk. Eating soy milk in the US, it's about 12 grams of protein per 8 ounces, and it's just soybeans and water. That's a pretty good option right there. Yeah. A lot of these innovative products, tofu's been around a long time, that's great, but some of these innovative products like lentil pasta, for example, I think is a really good option because it's high in protein. It's if you're replacing normal pasta, for example, you could you're going to get much more protein. You could either reduce the amount of meat you have with that pasta, or you could just have the pasta by itself with lentils. And if you consume that, you're also getting a lot of fiber and other benefits. And what I think some people may not realize is that some people have a problem with pulses, consuming a lot of them, right? I mean, bloating and gas. And there's generally probably an adjustment process. So if you don't consume a lot of pulses and you suddenly just have like a giant bowl of lentils, good luck, right?
It's going to be tough for a minute.
It's going to be tough. But there are a lot of processing techniques to reduce that impact. So one of them, if you just, the lentil pasta, for example, it's actually a much easier to absorb that and have not have digestive issues. There are products out there where the beans have been soaked or eaten. Again, they have black beans, for example. They've been soaked in a way that kind of reduces that.
Some of the raffinose and the carbohydrates that cause a lot of those concerns.
Yeah. And you can rinse, you can take a can of beans and you can rinse them pretty thoroughly with water to reduce a lot of that impact. So there are a lot of foods. I think I want to just be clear. I'm actually an advocate for having a moderate amount of animal source foods in the food system, but there's a large variety of people and preferences that can fit within that. So
for sure,
there can be people who are entirely plant-based who just consume plant products, and there can be people who have moderate amounts and people who have more amounts if they have that kind of need for whatever reason. But ultimately, what we're looking at is to make sure that our overall consumption fits within planetary boundaries, that it's supportive of ecosystems. And we all have some potential to make an impact, but a lot of people, some of these products, especially on the animal source foods, if they're humanely raised, if they're produced in regenerative practices, they're often more expensive. And there's just a reality that people can't always afford that. So I'd like to see at a systematic or a more like high level transformation to say, like, let's have the baseline of foods produced, including animal source foods, really produced in ways that are less destructive to the environment, that have higher welfare standards for animals, et cetera.
Yeah, great suggestions. And to wrap things up, Ty, you touched a little bit on this, but again, the evolution of research in this area, where do you see things in the next sort of 5 or 10 years?
So I think there's a lot of research in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing methane in the feed and different approaches there. Of course, these alternative proteins, these alternative foods like cell-based meat, microproteins, precision fermentation, I think that's going to be a really key area of research going forward. I think there's room for a lot of these approaches, and ultimately we should incentivize any type of approach that is really trying to prioritize producing nutritious foods that are, respectful of animals, at least to the extent possible, and that also facilitate healthy environments and are produced in ways that are beneficial. So that's my hope going forward.
Tremendous. Well, I mean, the paper was a tremendous read, and we'll put that up in the show notes for folks. Where can people stay connected with you and keep up with your research?
Yeah, so I'm probably most active on Twitter. That's Ty Beal, or TYRBEAL. And I'll post current studies, recent studies that I've worked on or just that I find interesting. So feel free to keep in touch there. And I'll also be happy to respond to any questions or queries that people may have.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the time, and always good to keep up with what you're doing. Really insightful. And it's obviously a very big question, but one that's impacting all of us, whether it's the health front, environment. So thanks again for the time.
Thanks for having me, Marc. It was a pleasure.